Join us for the heartwarming tale of Clarice Martin, a woman who finds herself homeless and desperate after being betrayed, until fate leads her to a farmhouse at the end of a dirt road. There, she encounters Thomas Reed, a man with his own painful past as they slowly build trust, heal old wounds and discover that sometimes home is found in the most unexpected places. Before we begin this story, comment below where you're watching from. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road as Clarice Martin dragged her tired feet forward. At 26, she never imagined she'd end up like this, hungry, homeless, and hopeless. Her once vibrant brown hair was tied in a messy knot, her hands were dirty from walking for hours, and her eyes revealed the fatigue of someone who had cried too much. Just keep moving, she whispered to herself, adjusting the small backpack that contained everything she now owned. 3 months ago, Clarice had a job at a downtown clothing store, an apartment she shared with 2 roommates, and what she thought was a loving boyfriend. Richard Banks had swept into her life with charm and promises, convincing her to co-sign loans for what he called their future. But the future disappeared along with Richard, leaving Clarice with crushing debt and a ruined credit score. When the final eviction notice came and her boss cut her hours because she looked too depressed to help customers, Clarice made a decision. She took the last $200 from her account, packed what she could carry, and left the city behind. No plan, just the desperate need to escape. Now, after 3 days of taking rides from strangers and sleeping at bus stations, her money was gone, and her stomach ached with hunger. The small town she'd reached was nothing more than a cluster of buildings surrounding a gas station. Beyond it stretched farmland and scattered houses. As the sun began to set, panic rose in her chest. Where would she sleep tonight? Her legs trembled from exhaustion as she continued down the dirt road leading out of town. That's when she saw it, a wooden gate standing open at the end of the road. Behind it, a modest farmhouse sat nestled among 3 tall cedar trees. Warm, light glowed from the windows and smoke curled from the chimney despite the mild weather. Clarice stopped, her heart pounding. She hadn't begged before, but hunger was a powerful motivator. She looked down at herself, worn jeans, a wrinkled t-shirt, and sneakers covered in dust. Not exactly making a good impression. "What choice do I have?" she murmured, taking a deep breath before pushing the gate further open. The hinges creaked slightly as she stepped onto the property. The farmhouse was larger than it had appeared from the road, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. And there, sitting in a wooden rocking chair, was a man. He didn't move as she approached, just watched her with calm eyes that neither welcomed nor rejected her presence. He held a straw hat in his hands, turning it slowly as if in thought. He appeared to be around 30, with sun-tanned skin and the solid build of someone who worked outdoors. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw partially covered by a short beard. Clarice stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly feeling every bit of her disheveled appearance. Shame burned her cheeks, but hunger pushed her forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice nearly a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm sorry to bother you, but—" Her pride crumbled as her stomach growled loudly. "I just need a plate of food. I promise I'll leave right after." The man studied her for what felt like eternity, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stood up, placed his hat on the railing, and motioned for her to follow him. Clarice hesitated, uncertain if she should trust this stranger. But when he opened the screen door and held it for her, something in his eyes told her she was safe. The kitchen was warm and smelled of home-cooked food. It was spacious but simple. Wooden cabinets, an old stove, and a large table that could seat 8 people. The man gestured toward a chair, and Clarice sat down, placing her backpack carefully beside her. He moved efficiently, taking a plate from a cabinet and filling it with rice, beans, and chunks of tender beef from pots on the stove. He set the steaming plate in front of her, along with a fork and a glass of water. "Thank you," Clarice said, trying to maintain her dignity while fighting the urge to devour the food instantly. The man nodded, then surprised her by taking a seat across the table. He watched as she took her first bite, then another, her hunger overwhelming her embarrassment. "The hunger passes," he said finally, his voice deep and steady. But you don't need to leave if you're just running from the world. Clarice paused, mid-bite, startled by his perception. I'm not running, she lied, then sighed, setting down her fork. Or maybe I am, but I don't have anywhere else to go right now. I'm Thomas Reed, he said, offering no judgment. This is Three Cedars Farm. Clarice Martin, she replied, noticing how his simple introduction made her feel human again after days of being invisible. Finish your meal, Clarice, Thomas said. There's a spare room upstairs. You can stay tonight, get some rest. Tears pricked at her eyes. Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes, she now noticed they were a deep brown, looking somewhere past her as if remembering something from long ago. I know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn, he said simply. Finish your food. I'll show you the room after. As Clarice ate, she noticed a framed photograph on the wall, a much younger Thomas standing beside an older man in front of the same farmhouse, both smiling. My grandfather, Thomas explained, following her gaze. He left me this place 5 years ago. It's beautiful, Clarice said honestly. Peaceful. A hint of a smile touched Thomas's lips. That's why I came back. The city has too many voices, too many people wanting pieces of you. Clarice understood that all too well. After dinner, Thomas led her upstairs to a small but clean bedroom with a patchwork quilt on the bed and a window overlooking the fields behind the house. Bathrooms across the hall, he said, pointing. There are clean towels in the closet. I can't thank you enough, Clarice said, overwhelmed by his kindness. Thomas nodded. Get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow. As he turned to leave, a golden retriever appeared in the hallway, wagging her tail curiously at the visitor. That's Brisa, Thomas said. She won't bother you. The dog approached Clarice cautiously, sniffing her hand before giving it a gentle lick. Hello, Brisa, Clarice said, smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks as she petted the soft golden fur. She likes you, Thomas observed. She's a good judge of character. After Thomas left, Clarice took a long, hot shower, washing away days, curved travel and worry. Wearing an oversized t-shirt from her backpack, she sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the day's turn of events. Just for tonight, she told herself. Tomorrow I'll figure things out. But as she slipped between clean sheets and felt the weight of exhaustion pulling her under, Clarice wondered what it would be like to stay in this peaceful place, away from the chaos she'd left behind. Morning came with the sound of a rooster crowing and sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a moment, Clarice was disoriented, then remembered where she was. She dressed quickly in her cleanest clothes and made her way downstairs. Thomas was in the kitchen, scrambling eggs at the stove. He wore a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled, revealing strong forearms. Brisa lay nearby, her tail thumping against the floor when she spotted Clarice. Good morning, Thomas said without turning around. Coffee's ready. Thank you, Clarice said, pouring herself a cup from the pot on the counter. I should get going after breakfast. I've imposed enough. Thomas placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. Where will you go? The question hung in the air. Clarice stared into her coffee, having no answer. I need help around here, Thomas said suddenly. The housekeeper who used to come weekly moved to be with her daughter last month. If you want to stay a few days, help with cleaning and cooking, I can offer room and board. Clarice looked up, searching his face for signs of pity or ulterior motives. She found neither, just a straightforward offer. I don't want charity, she said firmly. It's not charity if you work, Thomas replied, taking a seat with his own plate. Fair exchange. Clarice considered her options, which were painfully few. Just for a few days, she agreed, until I figure out my next step. Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied. I work outside most of the day. The house needs attention, dusting, laundry, basic upkeep. Can you cook? Yes, Clarice said. Nothing fancy, but I can make decent meals. Better than I can, Thomas said, a hint of humor in his voice as he gestured to the simple eggs they were eating. After breakfast, Thomas showed her around the house, a living room with comfortable if slightly worn furniture, a study filled with books, a mudroom with boots and jackets, and a large back porch overlooking fields of corn and wheat. I have 2 hired hands who help with the crops and livestock, Thomas explained. They have their own quarters near the barn. You probably won't see much of them except at lunch." "What do you grow here?" Clarice asked, genuinely interested. "Corn, wheat, some vegetables for personal use," Thomas replied. "We also have a small herd of cattle and some chickens. Nothing industrial-sized, but enough to make a good living." As he walked her around the property, Clarice noticed how Thomas relaxed outdoors. His posture became more natural, his eyes clearer. As he pointed out different areas of the farm, this was a man who had found his place in the world. "I should get to work," she said when they returned to the house. "Where do you keep the cleaning supplies?" Thomas showed her a closet filled with everything she'd need, then hesitated before leaving. "If you need anything, I'll be in the North Field today, or you can use the old radio on the kitchen counter. Channel 3 connects to the one in my truck." After he left, Clarice stood in the quiet house, still stunned by how quickly her situation had changed. Yesterday, she was hungry and homeless. Today, she had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and a purpose, however temporary. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing counters and mopping floors. As she worked, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done in months. The physical labor felt good, productive, healing in a way she hadn't expected. By noon, she'd cleaned most of the downstairs and started a load of laundry. When she heard vehicles approaching, she looked out to see Thomas and two other men, one older with grey hair, one younger with a baseball cap, walking toward the house. "You must be Clarice," the older man said when they entered. "I'm Frank, been working this land with the Reed family for 30 years. This here's my nephew, Javier." "Nice to meet you," Clarice said, surprised by their friendly acceptance of her presence. "Something smells good," Javier remarked, eyeing the kitchen. Clarice had found ground beef in the refrigerator and prepared a simple meal of spaghetti and meat sauce, with a salad from vegetables in the garden. "I hope it's okay that I cooked lunch," she said to Thomas, suddenly unsure. The hint of a smile appeared on his face. "More than okay. We usually make sandwiches." The four of them ate at the kitchen table, the men hungry after a morning of work. Frank told stories about the farm's history, while Javier asked Clarice polite questions about where she was from. She answered vaguely, saying only that she'd lived in the city but needed a change. Thomas remained mostly quiet, but Clarice caught him watching her interaction with the others, his expression thoughtful. After lunch, the men returned to work, and Clarice continued with her tasks. She found a vase, filled it with wildflowers from near the porch, and placed it on the kitchen table. The splash of color brightened the room immediately. By evening, she was tired but satisfied with her day's work. She'd prepared a simple dinner of chicken, potatoes, and green beans, setting it to keep warm in the oven for when Thomas returned. She sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Brisa lay beside her, head resting on her paws. This peaceful moment felt surreal after the chaos of recent months. "You've been busy," Thomas said, startling her as he approached from the barn. He'd cleaned up, his hair still damp from washing. "I hope I didn't overstep," Clarice said, standing quickly. "I made dinner, it's in the oven." "Thank you," he said, and she thought she detected genuine appreciation in his voice. "You didn't have to do all that. I wanted to earn my keep," she replied honestly. They ate dinner together, the conversation easier than the night before. Thomas asked her if she'd found everything she needed, and she told him about discovering old photographs in a drawer while dusting. "Your grandfather?" she asked, describing a picture of a young boy on a horse with an older man. Thomas nodded. "He taught me everything about this place, said the land would speak to me if I listened closely enough." "And does it?" Clarice asked. Thomas considered her question seriously. "Yes, it tells me when the soil needs rest, when the weather's about to change, when to plant and when to harvest." He paused. "The city never spoke to me that way. It just demanded." Clarice understood exactly what he meant. The city had taken and taken from her until there was nothing left to give. After dinner, they sat on the porch in comfortable silence as night fell. Stars appeared in the clear sky, more than Clarice had ever seen in the city. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Thomas looked at her in the dim light. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Clarice." She wondered if he could somehow see through her, know about the mistakes and bad decisions that had led her here. But his expression held no judgment, only quiet understanding. That night, as Clarice lay in bed, she realized she hadn't thought about Richard or her debts or her ruined life in the city all day. For the first time in months, she'd been focused on the present moment, cleaning a house, preparing meals, watching a sunset. Just for a few days, she reminded herself. But as sleep claimed her, a small voice inside whispered that perhaps she had found something worth staying for. Days turned into weeks at Three Cedars Farm. The few days Clarice had promised herself stretched longer as she fell into a comfortable routine. Each morning she woke with the sunrise, prepared breakfast and then tackled household chores, while Thomas worked the fields with Frank and Javier. On this particular morning, Clarice hummed as she hung freshly washed sheets on the clothesline behind the house. The late summer breeze caught the fabric, making it dance against the blue sky. Brisa lay nearby in a patch of sunlight, occasionally lifting her head to watch Clarice move back and forth with the laundry basket. "You're looking more at home every day," came a voice from behind her. Clarice turned to see Martha, Frank's wife, who occasionally brought homemade pies and casseroles to the farm. The older woman had been curious about Clarice at first, but her warmth and lack of probing questions had quickly won Clarice's trust. "I guess I am getting used to things here," Clarice admitted, securing another clothespin. "Thomas seems happier too," Martha observed with a knowing smile. "That man was turning into a hermit before you showed up." Clarice felt her cheeks flush. "We have a business arrangement. I work. He provides room and board." Martha chuckled, placing a covered dish on the porch table. "Honey, I've known Thomas Reed since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. That man doesn't let just anyone into his life. The way he looks at you when you're not watching, that's not business." Before Clarice could respond, Martha patted her arm. "Just brought over some apple cobbler. Tell Tomas I said not to eat it all in one sitting this time." As Martha drove away in her old pickup truck, Clarice reflected on her words. Had Thomas been looking at her differently? She'd noticed small changes in him. He smiled more often, sometimes brought wildflowers from the fields and placed them on the kitchen counter, and stayed up talking with her on the porch long after. Dinner was finished, but a relationship was the last thing Clarice needed. Her life was still in shambles, even if she'd temporarily escaped it. The debt collectors would eventually find her. Richard's loans were still in her name. The thought of bringing those problems to Thomas's peaceful doorstep made her stomach twist with guilt. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Tomas appeared on his chestnut horse, Thunder, riding in from the eastern fields. He slowed the horse as he approached, and Clarice couldn't help but admire how natural he looked in the saddle, his broad shoulders relaxed and his face peaceful. "Taking a break?" she called out, trying to ignore Martha's words echoing in her mind. Thomas dismounted with easy grace. "Checking the fences on the east side. Thought I'd see if you wanted to ride out to the creek for lunch." He held up a small backpack. "I packed sandwiches." The invitation surprised her. Tomas usually ate lunch with Frank and Javier in the fields, or came back to the house for a quick meal before returning to work. "I don't know how to ride," Clarice admitted, suddenly self-conscious. Thomas's lips curved into a rare, full smile that transformed his serious face. "Thunder can carry us both if you're not afraid." Clarice hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Let me put away the laundry basket." Minutes later, she found herself seated in front of Thomas on Thunder's broad back, his arms reaching around her to hold the reins. The closeness made her pulse quicken. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back and smell the clean scent of his soap mixed with sun and earth. Thunder walked steadily across the fields, following a path only Thomas seemed to know. They crested a small hill and Clarice gasped at the view, rolling farmland stretching for miles with a ribbon of trees in the distance marking the creek. "It's beautiful," she said, her worries momentarily forgotten. "This is my favorite view of the farm," Thomas replied, his voice close to her ear. "My grandfather used to bring me here when I was upset or confused, said you can see things clearer from up high." The personal share surprised her. Thomas rarely spoke about his feelings or past. "Were you upset often?" she asked carefully. "There," was a pause before he answered. "After my parents died when I was 12, yes, I was angry at the world. Grandpa was patient with me, taught me to channel that anger into working the land." "I'm sorry about your parents," Clarice said softly. "Car accident," Thomas explained simply. "Grandpa raised me after that. This place saved me." After a moment, he added, "What about your family, Clarice? You never mention them." The question caught her off guard. She'd been careful to avoid talking about her past during the weeks she'd spent at the farm. "My mom lives in Florida with her third husband," she said finally. "We don't talk much. My dad left when I was little. I don't even remember him." "So you're used to being on your own," Thomas observed, as thunder began descending toward the creek. "I guess I am," she replied, realizing how true it was. Even when she'd been with Richard, she'd essentially been alone. He'd been too focused on his schemes and needs to really see her. The creek was even more beautiful up close, clear water bubbling over smooth stones, shaded by old willow trees. Thomas helped her dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist before he tied Thunder to a low branch and spread a blanket on a grassy spot near the water. As they ate their simple lunch, Clarice found herself relaxing completely for the first time in years. The peaceful setting, the good food, and Tomas's quiet company created a moment that felt almost magical. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said, leaning back on her hands and turning her face to the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Tomas watched her, his expression softening. "You belong in places like this, Clarice, not hidden away in a kitchen." His words touched something deep inside her. "I don't mind the kitchen. Your house feels safe. It's your house too, as long as you want it to be," Tomas said, his voice low and serious. The moment hung between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Clarice felt a pull toward him that frightened her with its intensity. Before she could respond, thunder nickered softly, breaking the spell. Thomas cleared his throat. "We should head back. Storm clouds coming in from the west." The ride back was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the farmhouse, Clarice noticed an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway. A sleek black sedan that looked completely out of place in the rural setting. Tomas tensed behind her. "Were you expecting anyone?" "No," Clarice answered, a sense of dread washing over her. As they got closer, a man in an expensive suit stepped out onto the porch. Even from a distance, Clarice recognized him immediately. Edward Simmons, Richard's lawyer and business partner. "Do you know him?" Thomas asked, feeling her stiffen in front of him. "Yes," she whispered, her heart pounding. "From before, from the city." Thomas brought Thunder to a stop several yards from the house. "You don't have to talk to him if you don't want to." His protective tone gave her courage. "No, I need to face this, whatever it is." Edward smiled coldly as they approached, his gaze traveling over Clarice's simple clothes and wind-tousled hair. Well, quite the country girl now, aren't you, Clarice? Took me a while to track you down." "What do you want, Edward?" Clarice asked, grateful for Thomas's solid presence beside her. "Just delivering some paperwork," Edward said, holding up a large envelope. "Richard thought you'd want to know that. The bank is foreclosing on the condo next month, the one you co-signed for." His smile widened. "They'll be coming after your wages to recover the difference. But I see you found yourself a creative living arrangement." The suggestive tone in his voice made Clarice's face burn with anger and embarrassment. Tomas stepped forward, his expression hard. "I think you should leave now." Edward raised an eyebrow. "And you must be the gentleman farmer. Has she told you about the mess she left behind? The debt collectors? The credit card fraud investigation?" "Fraud?" Clarice gasped. "I never committed." "Fraud? Richard forged my signature." "That's not what the evidence suggests," Edward cut in smoothly. "Richard was quite careful about having witnesses to your signatures, including me." Thomas moved closer to Edward, his height advantage obvious as he looked down at the lawyer. "You've delivered your message. Now get off my property." Something in Thomas's tone must have registered as a genuine threat, because Edward stepped back, placing the envelope on the porch railing. "All the details are in there," he said to Clarice. "I'd start saving up if I were you. They'll find you eventually, even out here in the middle of nowhere." After Edward drove away, leaving a cloud of dust behind his expensive car, Clarice felt her knees weaken. Thomas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Come inside," he said gently. "We'll figure this out." In the kitchen, Clarice's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside were legal notices, bank statements, and a handwritten note from Richard. Should have stuck with me, babe. At least I know how to run when things get hot. $50,000, she whispered, looking at the loan default notice. I never even saw this money. Richard said it was for renovations on the condo, but he took it and ran, Tomas finished, his expression grim. Tears of frustration and shame filled Clarice's eyes. I was so stupid. I believed everything he told me. And now, she gestured helplessly at the papers. I can't drag you into this mess. I should leave before... Before what? Tomas interrupted, his voice firm. Before they come looking for money you don't have. Running won't solve this, Clarice. I know that, she said, wiping angrily at her tears, but I can't stay here and bring my problems to your doorstep. You've done too much for me already. Tomas was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. Do you want to leave? Not because of these papers or that sleazy lawyer, but because you want to go? The question cut through her panic. Did she want to leave? The thought of never seeing Three Cedars Farm again, never seeing Tomas again, created an ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. No, she admitted softly, I don't want to leave. Then don't, Tomas said simply. We'll handle this together. I know a good lawyer in town, David Wilson. He specializes in cases like this. I can't afford a lawyer, Clarice protested. I can, Tomas replied. Consider it an advance on your salary. Salary? Clarice looked up in confusion. But I work for room and board. Tomas smiled slightly. I think it's time we made your position here official. The farm's doing well, and I could use a permanent housekeeper with actual wages. The offer stunned her. You'd do that for me, even after learning about all this? Clarice, Tomas said, his voice softening. We all have pasts. What matters is who we choose to be now. And He hesitated, then continued, more carefully, I value having you here, more than I expected to. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Before either could say more, the telephone rang, breaking the moment. Tomas answered it, his expression changing. As he listened, When? How bad? All right, tell him I'm on my way. He hung up and turned to Clarice. That was Frank. Javier had an accident with the tractor, cut his leg badly. They've taken him to the clinic in town, but Frank says he'll need someone to stay with him tonight. Go, Clarice said immediately. I'll be fine here. Tomas hesitated, looking at the legal papers scattered across the table. We're not finished with this conversation. I know, Clarice assured him. Take care of Javier. We can talk tomorrow. After Tomas left, Clarice sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the evidence of her past mistakes. The peaceful bubble she'd been living in for weeks had burst. Reality had found her, just as she'd feared it would. She gathered the papers, putting them back in the envelope. Despite her anxiety, Tomas's words echoed in her mind. We'll handle this together. No one had ever offered to stand beside her through trouble before. That evening, Clarice made dinner as usual, though only she and Brisa were there to eat it. She fed the chickens and closed up the coop for the night, tasks she'd learned to do in case Tomas was late. As darkness fell, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Brisa's head resting on her lap. The night was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. What should I do, Brisa? She whispered, stroking the dog's soft fur. Is it selfish to stay to let him help me with my problems? Brisa looked up at her with soulful eyes that seemed to say the answer was obvious. The sound of a car approaching made Clarice sit up straighter. It was nearly midnight, too late for casual visitors. Had Edward returned? Or worse, had Richard somehow found her too? She stood ready to retreat inside and lock the door when she recognized Martha's old pickup truck. The older woman hurried up the porch steps, her expression concerned. I just heard about Javier, Martha said. Tomas called from the clinic and asked me to check on you. Said you had a visitor earlier who upset you. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Clarice's eyes. Even in the midst of dealing with Javier's accident, Tomas had worried about her. Come inside, Clarice said, touched by Martha's concern. I'll make fresh tea and I could use someone to talk to. Over tea at the kitchen table, Clarice found herself telling Martha everything about Richard, the loans, Edward's visit, and her fears about bringing trouble to 3 Saida's farm. Martha listened without interruption, her weathered face showing no judgment, only compassion. "You're not the first person to be fooled by a smooth talker," Martha said when Clarice finished, "and you won't be the last." "But what should I do now?" Clarice asked. "Thomas offered to help, to pay for a lawyer. I don't want to take advantage. To have his kindness." Martha reached across the table and patted Clarice's hand. "Let me tell you something about Thomas Reed. When he came back here after his grandfather died, he was broken inside. The city and its people had used him up, just like your Richard used you. He'd lost his trust in others. What happened to him?" Clarice asked, realizing how little she knew about Tomas's time away from the farm. "He got engaged to a woman named Vanessa," Martha explained. "She claimed to love the idea of farm life, but really she just loved the idea of transforming Tomas into someone else, selling this place, moving to the suburbs, joining country clubs." Martha shook her head. "When he caught her cheating with his business partner and discovered they'd been siphoning money from his accounts, it broke something in him." Clarice's heart ached at the thought of Tomas being betrayed so cruelly. "That's why he lives alone now." "Until you came along," Martha pointed out. "Shan, all these years, you're the first person he's let stay in that house, the first person he's let get close. But that makes it worse," Clarice protested. "If he's been hurt before, the last thing he needs is my financial problems and legal troubles." Martha fixed her with a stern look. "That man has been watching you bring his house back to life. You've filled it with flowers and good food and laughter again. Do you think he cares about money? He owns hundreds of acres of prime farmland, for heaven's sake." "Then what does he care about?" Clarice asked softly. Martha's expression softened. "He cares about you, honey, even if he's too stubborn or cautious to say it yet." Later that night, as Clarice lay in bed, Martha's words replayed in her mind. Could Thomas really have feelings for her? And more importantly, what about her own feelings? She'd been so focused on surviving, on running from her problems, that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She was falling in love with Thomas Reed. With his quiet strength, his integrity, the gentle way he treated everything, from his animals to his land to her, the realization both thrilled and terrified her. Love had led her astray before with disastrous consequences, but Thomas wasn't Richard. Everything about him was different, solid, trustworthy, real. Tomorrow, she decided, she would tell Thomas the whole truth, not just about the loans and Richard's deception, but about her growing feelings for him. If he still wanted to help her after that, she would accept, and if he didn't, well, she'd face that possibility when the time came. Outside her window, the moon cast silver light across the fields of 3 Cedars Farm. For the first time since Edward's visit, Clarice felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Morning came with the gentle patter of rain against the window pane. Clarice opened her eyes, momentarily disoriented by the grey light filtering through the curtains. The events of yesterday rushed back. Edward's visit, the legal papers, Martha's revelations about Thomas's past, and most importantly, her own realization about her feelings for Thomas. She dressed quickly in jeans and a simple blouse, pulling her hair into a neat ponytail. Today was the day she would tell him everything. The thought made her stomach flutter with nerves, but she was determined. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. A note on the table in Tomas's neat handwriting explained that he'd stayed overnight at Javier's place to help him get settled after returning from the clinic. He'd be back by mid-morning. Clarice busied herself making a hearty breakfast, pancakes, bacon, and fresh coffee. Cooking had always calmed her nerves, and she needed that calm now. As she worked, Brisa kept her company, hoping for dropped bits of bacon. "What do you think, girl?" Clarice asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Will he understand? Or will he think I'm just another woman trying to take advantage of him?" The sound of a vehicle approaching made her heart leap into her throat. She glanced at the clock, 9:30 a.m. It must be Thomas returning. She wiped her hands on a towel and went to the front door, ready to greet him, but stopped short when she saw not Thomas's truck, but a police cruiser pulling into the driveway. Her first thought was that something had happened to Thomas, and cold fear washed over her. But as the car stopped and a uniformed officer stepped out, she realized this was about her. Edward's words echoed in her mind. Credit card fraud investigation. With trembling hands, she opened the door before the officer could knock. "Clarice Martin?" he asked, his expression professional but not unkind. "Yes," she answered, her mouth suddenly dry. "I'm Sheriff Miller," he said, removing his hat. "I need to speak with you regarding some financial matters." "May I come in?" Clarice stepped aside, her legs feeling weak. "Of course." In the kitchen, she offered him coffee, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. She noticed he didn't take out handcuffs or raid her rights, which calmed her slightly. "Miss Martin," he began, setting down his cup, "I received a call from a Mr. Edward Simmons yesterday, claiming you were involved in some financial irregularities back in the city." "He's lying," Clarice said immediately, then forced herself to take a deep breath. "I mean, yes, there are financial problems, but I didn't commit fraud. My ex-boyfriend, Richard Banks, forged my signature on loan documents and credit applications." Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. "That's actually consistent with some information that came across my desk this morning. It seems Mr. Banks has been involved in similar situations with at least 2 other women in the past 3 years. Hope flickered in Clarice's chest. "There are others?" "Yes, and one of them has been working with authorities to build a case against him," the sheriff explained. "Your name came up in their investigation, which is partly why I'm here." "I don't understand," Clarice said, confusion replacing her fear. "If they know Richard is the one committing fraud, why are you questioning me?" "I'm not here to arrest you, Miss Martin," Sheriff Miller clarified. "I'm here because the detective handling the case in the city asked me to inform you that they need your testimony. Mr. Banks was taken into custody yesterday evening." The news hit Clarice like a physical blow. Richard arrested? After months of wondering if she'd ever see justice, it seemed almost too good to be true. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "You'll need to give a formal statement and provide any documentation you have regarding the loans and credit cards," the sheriff explained. "The detective handling the case, a Detective Rodriguez, would like you to call her as soon as possible." He handed her a business card with a phone number. As she took it, the sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Through the window, Clarice saw Thomas's truck pull up behind the police cruiser. Thomas entered quickly, his expression concerned as he took in the scene, Clarice sitting at the table with a uniformed sheriff. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tense. "Sheriff," Miller stood and extended his hand. "Tom Reed. Been a while." "Mark," Thomas acknowledged with a nod, shaking his hand but still looking worried. "Everything all right?" "Just delivering some news to Ms. Martin," the sheriff explained. "Her ex-boyfriend has been arrested for fraud. Seems he's been running the same scam on multiple women." Thomas's eyes found Clarice's across the room, relief evident in his expression. "So she's not in trouble?" "Quite the contrary," Sheriff Miller replied. "She's a victim and her testimony could help put this guy away for a good long time." After the sheriff left, promising to be in touch about arrangements for Clarice's statement, silence filled the kitchen. The pancakes had gone cold, forgotten during the unexpected visit. "Richard's been arrested," Clarice said, still processing the news. "All this time I've been running, thinking I'd have to pay for his crimes, and he's finally been caught." Tomas sat down across from her, his expression serious. "That's good news, but you still have the loans to deal with." "Yes," she agreed, her momentary elation fading. "The debts are still in my name, even if they can prove fraud. That's why we're going to see David Wilson today," Tomas said firmly. "I already called him this morning from Javier's place. He's expecting us at 11. Clarice looked up, surprised. "You still want to help me? Even after everything that's happened?" Tomas reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, covered her hand with his. "Clarice, nothing that happened yesterday changes how I feel about—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "About having you here. If anything, it just confirms what I already knew about you." "What's that?" she asked softly. "That you're honest, that you take responsibility even when things aren't your fault, that you're stronger than you think." His voice grew quieter. "That you belong here." The words sent warmth spreading through her chest. This was the moment to tell him how she felt, but before she could speak, Tomas stood up. "We should get going if we want to make it to David's office by 11, he said, the moment slipping away. and we should stop by the clinic to check on Javier on the way back. The drive into town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Lakeville was a small but charming town about 20 minutes from Three Cedars Farm. Main Street featured brick buildings from the early 1900s, small shops, a cafe, and the professional offices of the town's doctor, dentist, and single attorney, David Wilson. Wilson's office was above the pharmacy, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked underfoot. The waiting room was small but comfortable, with worn leather chairs and framed diplomas on the walls. David Wilson himself was a surprise to Clarice. She'd expected someone older, like Thomas's grandfather might have been, but David was in his early 40s with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Thomas," he greeted warmly, shaking hands. "Good to see you, and this must be Ms. Martin." "Clarice, please," she corrected, shaking his hand. "Let's talk in my office," David suggested, leading them through a door into a room lined with law books and filing cabinets. Over the next hour, Clarice explained her situation in detail, her relationship with Richard, the loans and credit cards he'd convinced her to co-sign, her discovery that he'd forged her signature on other documents, and finally the news of his arrest. David listened attentively, taking notes and asking occasional questions. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "The criminal case against Mr. Banks will help, but it doesn't automatically clear your financial obligations," he explained. "However, we can use his arrest and the fraud investigation to negotiate with the creditors." "What are her chances?" Thomas asked. "Better than they would have been without his arrest," David replied honestly. "But it's still going to take time, and there may be some debts that can't be completely erased." "I don't have much money," Clarice admitted, "but I'll pay whatever I can." David looked at her with kindness. "Let me make some calls, review these documents, and see what we can do. In the meantime, I suggest you contact Detective Rodriguez as soon as possible. Your cooperation with the criminal case will only help your financial situation." As they left the office, Clarice felt a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. For the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal, she was taking action instead of running. It was terrifying, but also liberating. "Thank you," she said to Thomas as they walked down Main Street toward his truck, "for believing in me, for helping me face this." Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're doing all the hard work. I'm just along for the ride." "No," she insisted, stopping on the sidewalk. "You've done so much more than that. You gave me a place to stay when I had nowhere else to go. You trusted me when you had every reason not to trust anyone." A group of people exiting the cafe nearby interrupted the moment, and Tomas gently guided her toward his truck. "Let's check on Javier, then head home. We can talk more there." Javier was staying at his aunt's house on the edge of town, a small, neat home with bright flower beds and a screened porch. His injury, while painful, wasn't as serious as initially feared. The tractor blade had cut his calf deeply, requiring 20 stitches, but had missed major blood vessels and tendons. "Doc says I'll be back on my feet in a couple weeks," Javier told them cheerfully from his position on the couch, his leg propped up on pillows. "Till then, I'm stuck watching soap operas with Aunt Elena." "We'll manage without you," Tomas assured him. Frank's calling his nephew Miguel to help out temporarily. As they said their goodbyes, Eleanor pulled Clarice aside. "Thank you for making Thomas happy," the older woman said quietly. "We've all been worried about him these past few years." Before Clarice could respond, Eleanor pressed a small cloth bag into her hands. "Herbs from my garden. For tea. Good for calming the heart when it's troubled." The drive back to the farm was filled with a comfortable silence. The rain had stopped, and sunshine broke through the clouds, creating a patchwork of light and shadow across the landscape. As they turned onto the dirt road leading to Three Cedars Farm, Clarice gathered her courage. "Thomas, there's something I need to tell you." He glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "What is it?" She began, but stopped as they rounded the final curve and the farmhouse came into view. A sleek red convertible was parked in the driveway, and a woman in an expensive-looking outfit stood on the porch. Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Vanessa, he said, his voice suddenly cold. Clarice felt as if she'd been doused with ice water. Vanessa, Thomas's ex-fiancée, who had cheated on him and stolen from him. What was she doing here? Thomas parked the truck, his expression unreadable, as he switched off the engine. Stay here, he told Clarice. I'll handle this. No, Clarice said firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. I'm coming with you. Together they approached the porch where Vanessa waited, a calculating smile on her perfectly made-up face. She was beautiful in a polished, artificial way. Sleek, blonde hair, designer clothes, flawless makeup. Tommy, she purred, stepping forward as if to embrace him. It's been too long. Thomas stopped just out of her reach. What are you doing here, Vanessa? Can't a girl visit an old friend? She asked, her smile faltering slightly as her gaze slid to Clarice. And who's this? The new housekeeper. The dismissive tone made Clarice bristle, but she held her tongue. This was Thomas's battle to fight. Clarice is... Thomas hesitated, then continued firmly. Important to me. Now, why are you here? Vanessa's smile disappeared entirely. Fine. Let's skip the pleasantries. I need money, Tommy. The business deal I was working on fell through and I'm in a tight spot. Thomas laughed without humor. You have some nerve coming here asking for money after what you did? Ancient history, Vanessa said with a wave of her manicured hand. We were both young and stupid. I've changed. Her voice softened, becoming persuasive. I've missed you, Tommy. Missed this place. Sometimes I think leaving was the biggest mistake of my life. Clarice watched Thomas carefully, fear rising in her throat. Would he believe Vanessa? Was there still something between them? The biggest mistake of your life, Thomas repeated slowly, was thinking I'd ever trust you again. I want you off my property, Vanessa. Now. Vanessa's beautiful face hardened. Don't be hasty. I still have those photos of us, you know. The ones. Franz Cabo. The investors at your agricultural cooperative might be interested to see their clean-cut farmer in a different light. Blackmail now, Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. You really have changed for the worse. I prefer to call it negotiation, Vanessa replied coolly. $10,000 and the photos stay private. Before Thomas could respond, Clarice stepped forward, anger overcoming her usual reserve. You should leave, she told Vanessa firmly. Whatever you think you have on Thomas, it won't work. People here know who he really is. Honest, hard-working, trustworthy. Nothing you do can change that. Vanessa looked Clarice up and down with contempt. And what are you to him? Another charity case he picked up? Tommy has a weakness for strays. She turned back to Thomas. Tell me she's not sleeping in my old room. Your old room, Thomas repeated, his voice hard. You never belonged here, Vanessa. This was never your home because you never cared about it or me. I cared about the potential, Vanessa shot back. This place could have been something if you'd been willing to sell it. We could have been rich. I am rich, Thomas replied simply. I have land that feeds people, work that matters, people who care about me, not what I can give them. He glanced at Clarice, his expression softening momentarily before returning to Vanessa. You need to leave. I won't ask again. Vanessa looked, from Thomas to Clarice and back, seeming to realize she'd lost. This isn't over, she warned, stepping off the porch and heading toward her car. You'll be hearing from me. They watched in silence as she drove away, dust billowing behind her expensive convertible. When she was gone, Thomas released a long breath. I'm sorry you had to see that. Don't be, Clarice said. I'm glad I did. It helps me understand you. Better. She hesitated, then asked, what photos was she talking about? Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, looking embarrassed. Nothing scandalous. Just some pictures from a vacation where I had too much to drink and made a fool of myself. Embarrassing, but hardly worth blackmailing over. Then why were you so angry? Because she came here, Thomas replied, his voice tight. To this place, my home. After everything she did, she still thinks she has a right to be here, to ask me for money. He shook his head. I was a fool back then, but I'm not anymore. They walked inside together, the tension from Vanessa's visit slowly dissipating as they moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner side by side. This had become their evening ritual. Clarice chopping vegetables while Thomas seasoned meat or stirred sauces. It was domestic and comfortable, a stark contrast to the drama of the day. As they sat down to eat, Thomas broke the comfortable silence. "You said there was something you wanted to tell me before we saw Vanessa." Clarice's heart skipped a beat. With everything that had happened, she'd almost forgotten her earlier determination to confess her feelings. Now, after witnessing the confrontation with Vanessa, she felt uncertain again. "It can wait," she said, avoiding his eyes. "It's been a long day." Thomas nodded, not pressing her. After dinner, they moved to the porch, watching as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. Brisa lay at their feet, occasionally lifting her head when a rabbit or fox moved at the edge of the fields. "Vanessa was right about one thing," Tomasi said suddenly. "I do have a weakness for strays." Clarice felt a pang in her chest. Was that all she was to him? A stray he'd taken in? "After my grandfather died," Thomas continued, "I was lost. The farm felt too big, too empty. I started rescuing animals, Brisa from the shelter, 2 barn cats that someone abandoned, a horse from a neglected farm down the county line." He glanced at her. "But you're different, Clarice." "How?" she asked, barely breathing. "The animals needed saving," he explained slowly. "You just needed a chance. There's a difference." He turned to face her fully. "You've brought something back to this place that I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" she whispered. "Life," he said simply. "Before you came, I was just going through the motions, working the land, paying the bills, existing but not really living." His voice softened. "You brought flowers and laughter and warmth back into this house, back into my life." Clarice felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, The telephone rang inside, cutting off her words. Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between finishing their conversation and answering the call. "It might be about Javier," Clarice suggested, giving him an out. With a frustrated sigh, Thomas went inside to answer it. Through the screen door, Clarice could hear his side of the conversation, short responses and questions that revealed nothing about who was calling. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "That was David Wilson. He's been making calls. About your case." "And?" Clarice asked, her heart sinking at his serious tone. "It's complicated," Thomas said, sitting back down beside her. "The good news is that with Richard's arrest and the evidence of fraud, you have a strong case for having some of the debt dismissed. The bad news is that the legal process could take months, even years." "I see," Clarice said, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd known there wouldn't be a quick fix, but hearing it confirmed was still disheartening. "There's more," Thomas continued. "David spoke to Detective Rodriguez. They're building a case against Edward Simmons, too. Apparently, he was helping Richard with the fraud. But they need you to testify in person." "In the city?" Clarice asked, immediately tense. The thought of returning to the place she'd fled from, of possibly seeing Richard again, filled her with dread. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "Sometime next week, according to David." The night suddenly felt colder as Clarice wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't know if I can face them." "You can," Thomas said with certainty. "You're stronger than you think." "Clarice!" After a moment, he added, "And you won't be alone, I'll go with you." She looked at him in surprise. "You'd do that? Leave the farm, go back to the city you hate?" "For you?" he said softly. "Yes." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clarice felt her heart expand with emotion, gratitude, hope, and something deeper that she was finally ready to name. "Thomas," she began, gathering her courage, "what I wanted to tell you earlier, what I need to tell you now, is that I'm falling in love with you." The words rushed out in a nervous stream. "I know it might be too soon, or you might not feel the same way, especially after everything with Vanessa, but..." Her rambling was cut short as Thomas reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Clarice," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I started falling in love with you the moment you arranged wildflowers in that old vase on the kitchen table. When you thought no one was looking, but I saw you." "You did?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I saw you," he repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. Not just that day, but every day since. I saw someone who cares about small things, making a house feel like a home, greeting the morning with hope even after all you've been through, treating every living thing with kindness. He moved closer, his free hand gently touching her cheek. I've been afraid to admit how I feel. After Vanessa, I promised myself I wouldn't be vulnerable again. But with you, it's different. You never asked me for anything except a plate of food that first day. Clarice smiled through tears that had begun to fall. And you gave me so much more. We gave each other more, Thomas corrected softly. You brought life back to this place, back to me. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, Thomas leaned forward. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that felt like coming home. Warm, safe, right? When they parted, Clarice stayed close, her forehead resting against his. What happens now? She asked. Now, Thomas said, his voice strong and sure. We face whatever comes. Together. We'll go to the city, you'll testify, we'll work with David to fix the financial mess, and then we'll come back here, to Three Cedars Farm, to our home. Our home, Clarice repeated, the words sounding like a promise. I like the sound of that. As night fell completely, and stars appeared above the fields, they remained on the porch talking softly about the future, making plans, sharing hopes. For the first time since she'd fled the city, Clarice wasn't running from her past. With Thomas beside her, she was running towards something better, a future built on trust, honesty and love. The house at the end of the road, which had once been just a desperate stopping point for a hungry stranger, was becoming exactly what Thomas had called it, their home. The city skyline loomed ahead as Thomas's truck merged onto the highway. Clarice gripped the edge of her seat, anxiety building with each mile marker they passed. After 3 months away, she was returning to the place where her life had fallen apart. You okay? Thomas asked, reaching across to take her hand. Just nervous, she admitted. I never thought I'd come back here. Thomas squeezed her hand reassuringly. Remember what David said. You're doing this on your terms now. You're not running or hiding anymore. They had left Three Cedars Farm at dawn, with Frank promising to keep everything running smoothly during their absence. The plan was simple but daunting. Meet with Detective Rodriguez, give Clarice's statement about Richard and Edward's fraud, attend the preliminary hearing, and talk to the bank representatives David had arranged meetings with. What if the judge doesn't believe me? Clarice asked, voicing the fear that had kept her awake for the past 2 nights. What if they think I was part of Richard's scheme? That won't happen, Thomas said firmly. The detective already told David they have evidence from the other victims that shows Richard's pattern. And Edward apparently started talking the moment they arrested him, trying to make a deal. This was news to Clarice. Edward turned on Richard. Thomas nodded. According to David, Edward is claiming Richard was the mastermind and he was just following orders. A hint of disgust crept into his voice. Seems loyalty isn't a strong point among thieves. As they entered the city proper, Clarice directed Thomas toward the police station downtown. The streets were crowded with morning commuters, and the noise and bustle felt overwhelming after months of farm life. I can't believe I used to think this was normal, Clarice murmured, looking out at the hurried pedestrians and honking cars. Thomas navigated the traffic with growing tension evident in his shoulders. This is why I left, he said. Too many people, too much concrete, not enough sky. They found parking near the police station, an imposing brick building with officers coming and going through the main entrance. Clarice took a deep breath before stepping out of the truck, steadying herself. Ready? Thomas asked, coming around to her side. She took his hand, drawing strength from his solid presence. Ready. Inside, they were directed to Detective Rodriguez's office on the 3rd floor. The detective turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her handshake was firm as she greeted them. Ms. Martin, thank you for coming in, she said, gesturing for them to sit in the chairs opposite her desk. And you must be Mr. Reed. Call me Thomas, he replied, keeping close to Clarice as they sat down. Detective Rodriguez opened a file folder in front of her. I want to be straightforward with you, Ms. Martin. We have a strong case against Richard Banks and Edward Simmons. 3 other women have come forward with nearly identical stories. Romantic involvement with Banks, followed by persuasion to co-sign loans or open joint credit accounts, then Banks disappearing with the money. How did you catch him? Clarice asked. His latest target got suspicious when she found documents with another woman's signature that he'd practiced forging, the detective explained. She contacted us, and we set up a sting operation. When we arrested him, he had fake IDs, credit, card applications in multiple names, and a ticket to Mexico. Relief washed over Clarice. So he really was planning to disappear for good. It looks that way, Detective Rodriguez confirmed. Now, I'll need to take your official statement, and then our ADA, Assistant District Attorney, would like to speak with you about testifying at the preliminary hearing tomorrow. Over the next 2 hours, Clarice recounted everything. How she'd met Richard at the clothing store where she worked, their whirlwind romance, his gradual financial requests that seemed reasonable at the time, and finally, her discovery of the additional loans he'd taken out in her name. Tomas remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a comfort as she relived the painful memories. When she described finding herself suddenly homeless and in debt, his hand tightened around hers. "You've been very thorough, Ms. Martin," Detective Rodriguez said when Clarice finished. "This will be extremely helpful to our case." After meeting with the Assistant District Attorney, a young woman named Melissa Chen, who explained what to expect at the hearing, they were finally free to leave. "That wasn't as bad as I expected," Clarice admitted as they walked back to Thomas's truck. "They seem to believe me." "Of course they believe you," Thomas said. "You're telling the truth." Their next stop was the small hotel David had recommended, where they checked into separate but adjoining rooms. The accommodations were simple but clean, a far cry from the luxury hotels downtown, where Richard had always insisted on staying during their brief weekend trips. "What time is our meeting at the bank tomorrow?" Clarice asked as they stood in the hallway between their rooms. 10 o'clock, Thomas replied. "After that we go to the courthouse for the hearing at 1. Clarice nodded, suddenly feeling the emotional toll of the day. "I should get some rest." Thomas brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "You did great today, Clarice. I'm proud of you." His simple praise meant more than any elaborate compliment Richard had ever given her. "Thank you for being here. I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have," Thomas corrected her, smiling slightly. "You're stronger than you think, but I'm glad I'm here too." After a light dinner at a nearby diner, they returned to their rooms for an early night. Tomorrow would be even more challenging, facing both the bankers and potentially Richard himself at the courthouse. Morning came with grey skies and the threat of rain. Clarice dressed carefully in the clothes Martha had insisted on lending her, a simple navy blue dress and matching jacket that looked professional without being flashy. The bank meeting went better than expected. David Wilson had clearly done his groundwork, providing documentation of Richard's arrest and evidence of the fraud. The bank representatives, while not immediately offering to forgive the loans, were willing to discuss restructuring the debt, with minimal interest until the criminal case was resolved. "This is very encouraging," David told them as they left the bank. "Once Banks is convicted, we'll have even more leverage to negotiate a settlement." "So she won't have to pay back the full amount?" Thomas asked. "It's likely the bank will agree to a reduced settlement," David confirmed, "especially since they'll be able to recover some assets from Banks himself." The news lifted a weight from Clarice's shoulders. For the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal, she could see a path forward. Difficult, perhaps, but not impossible. As they approached the courthouse, however, her anxiety returned full force. Somewhere inside that imposing stone building was Richard, the man who had nearly destroyed her life. "You don't have to look at him," David advised as they climbed the steps. "Just focus on the judge and answer the questions truthfully." The courtroom was smaller than Clarice had imagined, with wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, and the unmistakable smell of furniture polish. They took seats near the front, while David went to speak with the ADA. "You okay?" Thomas asked quietly. Clarice nodded, though her heart was pounding. "I just want this to be over." A side door opened, and several people entered. Court officers, attorneys, And finally, two men in handcuffs. Clarice's breath caught in her throat as she recognized Richard. He looked different. His usually perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit replaced by a standard jail jumpsuit, his confident smile nowhere to be seen. Beside him, Edward Simmons looked even worse, pale, unshaven, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. The judge entered, and everyone stood. As they sat, back down, Richard turned slightly, scanning the courtroom. His eyes locked with Clarice's for a brief electric moment. She expected to feel fear or anger, but instead she felt nothing. The power he'd once held over her was gone. The hearing proceeded with formal legal language as the charges were read, multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The ADA presented a summary of evidence, including testimony from previous victims and documentation of the financial transactions. When it was Clarice's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and walked to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she answered the ADA's questions calmly and clearly, describing her relationship with Richard and the financial deception she'd discovered. "And did the defendant have your permission to take out these additional loans in your name?" the ADA asked. "No," Clarice stated firmly. "I never saw those documents until after he disappeared. He forged my signature." Richard's attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, attempted to suggest that Clarice had been aware of the loans and had conspired with Richard, only turning against him when the relationship ended. "If that were true," Clarice responded, her voice steady, "why would I have left my job and home? Why would I have been sleeping at bus stations because I couldn't afford a hotel? If I had access to that money, don't you think I would have used it?" Her honest response seemed to hit home with the judge, who nodded slightly. When she was dismissed from the stand, Clarice returned to her seat beside Thomas, who squeezed her hand in silent support. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and denied bail for both defendants, citing Richard's previous attempt to flee and the serious nature of the charges. As the court officers prepared to lead Richard and Edward back to jail, Richard turned again, his eyes finding Clarice. This time there was something different in his gaze, not anger or defiance, but a flicker of regret quickly masked by his usual arrogance. Outside the courthouse, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the stone steps. Clarice turned her face up to it, feeling as though it was washing away the last lingering shadows of her old life. "You did it," Thomas said, standing close beside her. "How do you feel?" "Free," she replied honestly, "like I can finally move forward." David joined them, umbrella in hand. "That went very well. The judge clearly found your testimony compelling." He checked his watch. "I need to get back to Lakeville, but I'll be in touch about the next steps with the bank." After saying goodbye to David, Clarice and Thomas walked through the rain-washed streets, neither particularly anxious to return to the hotel just yet. "There's one more place I want to go before we leave the city," Clarice said suddenly. "Where's that?" Thomas asked. "My old apartment," she replied. "There's something I need to do." The building where Clarice had lived was in a decent neighborhood, though not as upscale as Richard had always claimed to prefer. They parked across the street, and Clarice looked up at the third-floor windows that had once been hers. "Do you want me to come with you?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "I need to do this alone. I won't be long." Inside, the building smelled the same, a mixture of cleaning products and the Indian spices from the family who lived on the first floor. Clarice climbed the familiar stairs to the third floor and knocked on apartment 3B. The door opened to reveal a young woman with curly hair and glasses. "Can I help you?" "Hi," Clarice began awkwardly. "I used to live here a few months ago. I'm Clarice Martin." Recognition dawned on the woman's face. "Oh, you're Clarice. I'm Jen. I took over your room when you left." "I know this is strange," Clarice continued, "but I was wondering if I could speak to Rachel or Madison, my old roommates." Jen's expression turned sympathetic. "Rachel moved back home to care for her mom. Madison's still here, though. She should be back from work soon." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in and wait?" The apartment looked both familiar and different. The same layout, but with new decorations, different photos on the walls. Clarice sat awkwardly on the couch where she'd once spent evenings watching movies with her roommates. "So," Jen said, clearly curious. Are you back in the city now? No, Clarice replied. Just here for some legal matters. I'm actually living in Lakeville now. She stopped short of mentioning Thomas or the farm, still protective of her new life. 20 minutes of small talk later, the door opened again, and Madison walked in, tall, athletic Madison, who had been Clarice's roommate for nearly 2 years before everything fell apart. Clarice! Madison stopped in her tracks, clearly shocked. What are you doing here? Clarice stood up, suddenly nervous. Hi, Maddie. I was in town and wanted to see you. Madison's expression was guarded. The last time I saw you, you were packing your things at midnight without saying goodbye. You didn't answer my calls or texts. I know, Clarice acknowledged, her voice thick with regret. I was ashamed. After what happened with Richard, the debts, losing my job, I couldn't face anyone. Madison's expression softened slightly. We were worried about you. Rachel and I filed a missing person report when we couldn't reach you. This was news to Clarice. You did? Of course we did, Madison replied, setting down her bag and crossing the room. You were our friend, not just our roommate. We knew something was wrong. Tears pricked at Clarice's eyes. I'm so sorry, Maddie. I should have trusted you. I was just so broken. Madison hesitated only a moment longer before pulling Clarice into a tight hug. You idiot, she said, but her voice was warm with affection. You didn't have to run away. We would have helped you. Clarice returned the hug, feeling another piece of her past healing. I know that now. I came to apologize and to let you know I'm okay. Over cups of tea, Clarice told Madison and Jen an abbreviated version of her story, finding shelter at Three Cedars Farm, working for Thomas, and finally, Richard's arrest. So this Thomas, Madison said with a knowing smile, is he just your boss? Or is there more to that story? Clarice felt her cheeks warm. It's complicated, but good complicated. I knew it, Madison declared triumphantly. You're glowing when you talk about him. Before leaving, Clarice exchanged new contact information with Madison and promised to stay in touch this time. The visit had given her something she hadn't realized she needed. Closure with the good. Parts of her old life, not just the painful ones. Thomas was waiting patiently in his truck when she emerged from the building. Everything okay? He asked as she climbed in. Better than okay, Clarice replied, feeling lighter than she had in months. I think I finally made peace with the city. Good, Thomas said, starting the engine, because I can't wait to get back to the farm. The return journey felt entirely different from their tense drive into the city the day before. As urban sprawl gave way to suburbs and then to open countryside, Clarice felt herself relaxing more with each mile. Thank you, she said after they'd been driving in comfortable silence for a while, for coming with me, for everything. Thomas glanced at her with a smile. You're welcome, but you did all the hard parts yourself. Not all of them, she disagreed. Having you there made it possible. As the familiar landscape around Lakeville came into view, Thomas suddenly pulled off onto a scenic overlook that provided a view of the valley where Three Cedars Farm lay. The late afternoon sun bathed the fields in golden light, making the farmhouse in the distance look like something from a painting. Why are we stopping? Clarice asked, curious. Thomas turned off the engine and shifted to face her. Because there's something I need to say before we get home, and I don't want any interruptions. His serious tone made Clarice's heart beat faster. What is it? These past few days, watching you face your past with such courage, it's made me realize something. He took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. I don't want to waste any more time being afraid of what might go wrong. Not when I know what's right. Clarice hardly dared to breathe. What do you mean? I mean that I love you, Clarice Martin. Not just a little, not just because you brought life back to my house, but completely, for exactly who you are. His voice grew softer. The woman who had the courage to walk up to a stranger's door and ask for help. The woman who filled my kitchen with delicious meals and my garden with flowers. The woman who stood up to Vanessa and faced down Richard in court. Tears filled Clarice's eyes as Thomas continued. I know it might seem fast. We've only known each other a few months. But sometimes, when something is right, you just know. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. This was my grandmother's. My grandfather gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found the right person. He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring, a single diamond surrounded by 2 small sapphires on a silver band. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Tomas clarified quickly. We can take all the time you need, but I am asking you to stay, not as my housekeeper or my girlfriend, but as my partner, in life, in the farm, in everything. Tears spilled down Clarice's cheeks as she looked from the ring to Tomas's earnest face. Are you sure? Even with all my baggage, the debt, the legal issues still to come? I've never been more sure of anything, Tomas replied firmly. Your past is part of who you are, and I love all of you. The question is, are you sure about me? About life on a farm, away from the city? Clarice smiled through her tears. The day I walked up your porch steps was the luckiest day of my life. I was just looking for a meal, but I found a home. I found you. She took a deep breath. Yes, Thomas Reed, yes to staying, yes to being your partner, yes to everything. Tomas slipped the ring onto her finger and then pulled her close for a kiss. That felt like a promise of home, of safety, of a future built together. When they finally continued driving, the setting sun cast long shadows across the fields leading to Three Cedars Farm. As they turned onto the familiar dirt road, Brisa came running to greet them, barking joyfully. Frank and Martha were waiting on the porch, along with Javier, who was up and about with the help of crutches. Welcome home, Martha called, hurrying down the steps to embrace them both. Her sharp eyes immediately spotted the ring on Clarice's finger, and she gasped with delight. Well, it's about time. News travels fast around here, Thomas remarked, with a wry smile. Small towns, Frank agreed, clapping him on the shoulder. No secrets, especially not when you ask the local jeweler to size your grandmother's ring while you're away. The evening turned into an impromptu celebration as Martha produced a homemade cake she'd prepared just in case, and Frank opened a bottle of sparkling cider he'd brought along. As they sat around the kitchen table, sharing food and laughter, Clarice looked around at these people who had become her family in such a short time. They knew her past now, her mistakes and struggles, and loved her anyway. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the farmhouse was quiet once more, Clarice and Thomas stood on the porch, gazing up at the stars. So much has changed since I first walked up these steps, Clarice mused, leaning against Thomas's side. I was so desperate that day, so hungry in every way. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders. And all you asked for was a plate of food. It was all I thought I deserved, she admitted. And now, Thomas asked, looking down at her. Clarice smiled, twisting the ring on her finger. Now I know better. I deserve to be loved, to have a home, to be happy. She looked up at him. And so do you. We both got more than we expected, Thomas agreed, pulling her closer. The night air was cool but comfortable as they stood together, planning their future in quiet voices, how they would expand the farm's vegetable garden in the spring, host a proper engagement party in the summer, perhaps hold a small wedding in the fall when the leaves turned golden. What about your legal issues, Thomas asked. Are you worried? Clarice considered the question. I'm concerned but not worried, if that makes sense. David seems confident we can work things out with the bank, and even if I have to pay back some of the money, I will. One step at a time. Together, Thomas reminded her. Together, she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. Inside the house, Brisa barked once, reminding them it was getting late. Hand in hand, they walked back inside, not as a homeless woman and a lonely farmer, but as two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Three Cedars Farm was transformed. White chairs lined the area beneath the 3 tall cedars that gave the farm its name. Wildflowers and ribbons decorated an arch where Thomas stood waiting, Frank beside him as best man. In the farmhouse, Martha helped Clarice with the final touches of her simple white dress. Madison had come from the city to serve as maid of honor, bringing with her the news that Richard and Edward had both pleaded guilty, facing years in prison. The bank settlement went through last week, Clarice told Madison as she adjusted her veil. With Richard's assets seized and the fraud proven, they agreed to cancel 70% of the debt. I'll be paying off the rest over 5 years, but it's manageable now. "And the farm?" Madison asked, smiling at her friend's obvious happiness. "Better than ever," Clarice replied. "The organic vegetable business is taking off. We're supplying 3 restaurants in Lakeville now, and Tomas is talking about expanding the orchard next spring." A knock at the door announced that it was time. Clarice took a deep breath, looking at herself one last time in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate, hungry stranger who had walked up that dirt road a year ago. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, with Frank's nephew Miguel playing guitar as Clarice walked down the aisle between rows of friends and neighbors who had come to feel like family. Javier, fully recovered from his accident, had brought his girlfriend. Even David Wilson was there with his wife. As Clarice reached Tomas, he took her hands in his eyes shining with love and certainty. "A year ago," the minister began, "a hungry traveler came to the end of a road, looking for nothing more than a meal. What she found instead was a home and a heart that had been waiting for her without knowing it." Clarice felt tears of joy threatening as Thomas squeezed her hands. Sometimes the smallest requests, a plate of food, a moment of kindness, open doors to the greatest blessings of our lives, the minister continued. "Today we celebrate not just the union of Thomas and Clarice, but the journey that brought them together." As they exchanged vows and rings, Clarice thought of all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment, the pain and betrayal, the desperate flight from the city, the hunger that had driven her to Three Cedars Farm. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been necessary to bring her here to this perfect day, to this man who loved her completely. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, beaming at them both. "You may kiss the bride." As Thomas pulled her close for their first kiss as a married couple, cheers erupted from their assembled friends and family. Brisa barked excitedly from her spot by Frank's side, a blue ribbon tied around her collar for the occasion. The reception took place in the barn, which had been transformed with twinkling lights, flowers, and long tables laden with food prepared by Martha and the other women from town. Music played, people danced, and laughter filled the air as the celebration continued into the evening. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the farm, Tomas found Clarice standing alone for a moment on the porch, looking out at the land that was now truly their home. "Any regrets, Mrs. Reed?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Clarice smiled, leaning into him. "Not a single one. You?" "Just one," Thomas replied, his voice serious. Clarice looked up at him in surprise. "What's that?" A smile broke across his face as he pulled her close. "That I didn't put another plate on the table sooner, so you might have found your way here before." Clarice laughed, her heart full to bursting with happiness. "It wouldn't have worked. I wasn't ready then. We both needed to go through what we did to appreciate what we have now." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then my only regret is withdrawn. Everything happened exactly as it should have." From inside the barn came the sound of Frank calling for the couple to return. It was time for their first dance. Hand in hand, they walked back to join their celebration, leaving behind the porch where their story had begun, with a simple request for food, and finding instead a love that would nourish them both for a lifetime. The hungry stranger and the lonely farmer had found in each other something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed: a heart to match their own, and a house at the end of the road that had finally, truly become home. The end.